Cy Hersh won't remember this, but I first met him sometime in the late 1970s. He came into the offices of The Nation magazine, where I was working as a very lowly assistant editor. I was allowed by the editor then, Victor Navasky, to sit in on their meeting. I was in awe. I knew he had broken the My Lai story in 1969 and the 1974 story about the CIA's domestic spying and the 1975 Project Jennifer story about the CIA's attempt to recover a sunken Soviet submarine. And then a few years later, I read his quite seminal biography of Henry Kissinger, The Price of Power. So I was in awe, and that was nearly 4 decades ago. Since then, Cy Hersh has broken dozens of other important stories and won many other awards on top of his 1970 Pulitzer Prize. Now he has given us a memoir about his decades as an investigative journalist and biographer. The Reporter is a very, very good book, a revealing book about Cy's own work and life, but also a highly skeptical history of our nation and times. Here is what Ray Klein, a high-ranking CIA officer, said about Cy Hersh in a once classified document. Quote, "I like Cy in a way. He's an arrogant son of a bitch. He's one of those whimsical, skeptical, iconoclastic fellows who's interested in a good story, and he has a shrewd nose for people and events, and who's doing his thing." Well, I guess this CIA fellow got it right for once. Okay, so Cy and I will have a conversation for 30 or 40 minutes, and then we will open things up to questions from all of you. And afterwards, Mr. Hersh has agreed to sign some books out in the lobby, and there are plenty of books. I understand you were working for nearly 4 years on a biography of Dick Cheney before you decided to drop that project and write a memoir. You say you have at least a partial manuscript based on many hundreds of interviews, and you write that you will return to the Cheney book when the time is right. So, is now the time?
He's still exchanging oxygen for nitrogen, unfortunately. That's what the issue is. Things run out. Time changes a lot of things, but I signed a contract right after, maybe in 2010, and I started work on it a little bit after that. I was still doing some stuff for the New Yorker, but all right, very good. You know, I can't tell how many things I've done like this in bigger venues, and when I was all over, everybody said we couldn't hear a thing. But that doesn't happen in New York. We get it. I can never hear a thing in a restaurant, any restaurant here. Anyway, so noisy. And what happened is, I'll just tell you a few things. You can see I began to give chapters in about 2013 and 14, 15, and everybody freaked because I don't want to cause heartache here, but Obama was very, very tough on leaks, and even there were some people prosecuted we didn't even know about. They just agreed to take a plea and did a year or two inside the government. So there were some people. It was very nerve-wracking. It was very tough. And I will tell you what, the one thing Cheney did, and it's a cliche to say it, but the notion of after 9/11, regarding the Constitution as a nuisance, all those prisons, those black prisons we heard about during the confirmation of the new CIA, Gina Haspel, who's head of the CIA, was actually quite bright. I'm sure she did everything bad that they said she did, but she's actually quite bright. Anyway, that was all funded off the books. I'll just give you an example. He ran 3 bank accounts with unbelievable amounts of money, not stolen. A lot of it came after we invaded, when we were planning to invade Iraq. The prison started mostly middle of 2000, early in 2012, but they got going later. And he had bank accounts. One would be obvious in Geneva, but the other 2 places weren't obvious. And the problem you had is the people who ran them for us in some cases were very prominent people in a country, a sort of a totalitarian country with which we had very good relations. Does that surprise you? If you're anti-communist, you're our boys. And two places where they were horrible leaders, but we were in deep with them because they were horrible leaders. And so I would have been sued to death too. That was the other issue, without naming names. So there were many reasons I couldn't do it while he's alive is the big issue. And unfortunately, he's got some sort of heart that keeps on going. No, I'm serious. It's some sort of new, they've recreated some animal heart. It's
okay, but you have a partial manuscript, and when he drops dead...
I have 5 or 6 chapters that are coherent and a bunch that aren't. And there's a cliche, you've seen, maybe people have seen photographs on my desk. I don't put anything in a computer. I mean, I write on a computer, but I don't put names in a computer. And I don't keep emails more than 1 or 2 days. I just erase everything, which makes me always calling people and saying, what's your email? But I don't do that.
So that brings me to ask the question, you said in the book that it became much harder to do what you do after 9/11. So do you encrypt your emails? Do you use emails?
After one of the things that happened after 9/11, as part of the Patriot Act, the government, the security people in our government, the FBI and other agencies, got the right, without getting a warrant, to get every phone call I make, to do, just to get the number. And I think I can say this. My good friend, Jim Risen, the one that wrote the story about 10 years ago about the first inside story in the New York Times about how all the rules were thrown out the window after 9/11, and all the rules insisting that you have to get a warrant before you listen to Americans. Even if you catch an American talking to somebody overseas, you still need a warrant. Those rules will change pretty much after 9/11. And Risen wrote about it. And the way they punished Jim, and I think it's okay to say this, is they went to everybody that they looked up all the numbers he'd called for years, and anybody that had been in the government, was in the government, they told them all, okay, we know you've talked to him, we know you talked to him recently, just don't do it again. So he was just cut off, he was disappeared from having access to a whole body of people, and he had a lot of people in the government and in the CIA that talked to him. And, we're the only country in which the CIA is, for years, most covert guy he's listed in the phone book in Bethesda, It's not hard to find them. Anyway, it still happens. It's just that made it harder. It made it harder to communicate with people, knowing that anybody could, without a warrant. And I will tell you, in a perfect world, and we're not in a perfect world, the FISA court's useless. It's got to be written. That legislation is just no good. I can tell you from people inside that have seen some of the pathetic basis the government has offered the courts. It's a secret court. Judges serve on the secret court. There's about 15 of them. Federal judges at random are asked to serve 2 or 3 year terms. Good, they go back and forth. But everything the government said is taken at face value. And the courts just, it's not about politics, because some of the people in the court are libertarian Republicans who are the most assiduous about the Constitution, much more than other judges, even Democrats. But it's just useless. It relies on the government's integrity. And that's just crazy.
So, wait a minute, are you saying that you can't use the phone to call up a source?
Sure you can, but you have to lay down a pattern of dozens of calls about sports, about pets, about parties.
And then meet them in a dark place?
No, you can do it much easier. It's easy to do. Once you just talk to people a lot, call them a lot, and they call me back a lot, and talk gossip about stories and stuff like that. And these are people on the inside. We don't talk about anything inside, but you can demonstrate if somebody's looking at it that I've had 10 years or 12 years of talking to this person, 3, 4, 5 times a month. So that would knock them out as a suspect. But I'm aware of it, and I was told, within 2 months of 9/11, somebody in the inside. When 9/11 happened, there was a panic, and I've been in this business about 800 years, so I know people all the time. I've had a lot of people on the inside that know me. So I called somebody very high up in one of the agencies on a Sunday morning I know he went to church, after church, and he answered the phone at home, and I said, what do we have going here? This is 2 weeks after 9/11, when there was a tremendous panic. Is Al-Qaeda going to Is it in 5 different airports? Are we going to get this? Are they that good? And he said, I'll never forget this. He said, nope. He said, those 19 guys are like a pickup team in soccer that went to the World Cup, or like a pickup team in basketball that went to the Final
They're
Four.
really lucky.
More than that. The CIA had 3, the FBI had 3, and the NSA had 3. And they didn't share any with each other. And then I tell just a small point in this book, but I was sort of really, my parents are immigrants. And I get out of college, 10 years. I got to the University of Chicago. I didn't have to pay. I worked my way through school because my father died of cancer early. And 10, 11 years after getting out of college, I was an editor of the Yale Daily News of the Harvard Crimson. In My Lai, in 1969, I'm sticking 2 fingers into the eye of a sitting Republican president whose campaign won the election probably by saying he had a secret plan to end the war, and his secret plan turned out to be to win it. He didn't tell us that. To start bombing Cambodia secretly, and getting hoopla, prizes, speeches. Also, I won 5, 6, 8 prizes, and first enough money to get a down. Am I losing you again? This is terrible. I wish there was a lavalier. I'm told. But then you won't be able to see me. So to give you pleasure, I'll point it up higher. So anyway, so there we are. I mean, the point being that there's nothing like America, and to see where we are now is a little scary. But I grew up in a generation where go get it. And right now, I think that I blame cable news because they've diminished everything. News report, no matter how much MSNBC and CNN hate them and how much Fox loves them, any tweet is immediately tweeted with breaking news. There's no time to absorb anything. There's no time. It's breaking news. And when I was at the New York Times, the idea of writing a good story and then going on 2 or 3 TV shows that night to pimp them I would have been thrown out the door. And now that's all part of the game. It's all different.
So let's get back to the memoir.
Okay.
This is actually a real memoir, and it talks about your childhood, growing up on the South Side,
right.
Working in your father's business.
Running it when he died. He died at 16.
Yeah.
In a black ghetto.
In a black ghetto. And I sort of get the sense from the narrative that, you grew up learning street smarts, and that helped you a lot being a reporter.
I grew up running a business all from my senior in high school through. We weren't smart enough to sell it. How I understand Holocaust survivors saying we had this store, it was making enough money, and we could live on it, so we stayed there. And my mother was there, and she would come and work sometimes, but I was running it, and we should have just sold it. My mother should have gotten the job. I could have gone to college, but we stayed. I did it for 4 years. Going in the morning.
And then
I'll tell you, but let me just say, I got to know, there were people that worked for me. And in Chicago, there were people that worked for me, guys pressing pants, and I got to know them. And I got to be friendly with them. They were young. I was much younger. I was 16, 17. And sometimes there was Negro baseball. Every other week in Chicago, Comiskey Park was only about 10 blocks away from where my father's. We'd go with them to Negro Sunday baseball, 40,000 people, and they'd come from church, all in suit and tie. And he was articulate and charming, but he knew that I had a life he couldn't have. I mean, I saw the limits. And I got to know people like Mahalia Jackson, who nobody in the white world I knew, but she was famous in Europe. I used to go deliver clothes and spend time talking to her. When I got to the AP later, about 10 years later, I wrote long stories about her. I went and spent time because she was just, anyway. So I got to know, and I was a police reporter in Chicago. My first job was as a police reporter.
Well, before you get to there, life, it's clear from your memoir that life is often full of accidents. And at one point, your life was someone intervened by the name of Bernard Cogan. Tell us about Cogan.
Well, I was always sort of the whiz kid in high school. There were 3 of us that got these high scores. The other 2 went off to Harvard and scholarships, and nobody talked to me about college. It was an immigrant family. Their first language was Yiddish, and so I picked up enough because we had to know when they were saying things about us. But anyway, and so I do this crazy thing, and I barely get out of high school. My father's dying, and he did die at the end of my senior year. And so I basically gave up on high school. I just showed up enough to pass. There were teachers who were very angry at me because I'd been such a good student. And I was too dumb to talk about it. You don't talk about that. And so I ended up going, the only thing, there was a junior college that was free, the University of Illinois, which is a downstate, a plenty good state university. After World War II, so many GIs came home, and they couldn't afford to go there. So they set up a 2-year free junior college at a pier that had been built by the Navy for training navigators. And it was on the water, hadn't been used, and they repainted it, and they made it a junior college. And so I enlisted in that in 1964. I had not thought about college, and nobody talked to me about it. My friends went off, but everybody assumed there was some rationality in my family, which there wasn't. I was always a reader. I used to, from the age of 13 on, I would buy the annual, for 99 cents or $1, the annual nonfiction Book of the Month Club. People don't remember how big the Book of the Month Club was. It was huge.
Right. Into the mic.
Okay, into the mic. Oh, now you can hear me. Oh, I'm so sorry. You missed the great story all about me and Marilyn Monroe and stuff like that. Anyway, so I would always get, half the time it would be J. Edgar Hoover on communism or John Gunther, but there was a lot of history stuff. So I read all that stuff. So I go to this college, the junior college. It starts in September. That's free. And I'm in an English course. And it's a big course, and it's taught by a guy just out of the university. He just got his doctorate from Chicago. His name was Cogan, Bernard Cogan. It was his first teaching job. It was a good job to get, teaching English. Right out of college, right out of graduate school. And so there was a paper he asked for about, I remembered it not even at the time, at the end of the memoir I remembered. I did Somerset Maugham. I used to read his novels against probably somebody, I don't know, an American novelist, probably, not Catcher in the Rye, but the other one that everybody wrote, whatever. Another very typical. I love Saul Bellow, and I later fantasized I was Augie March, a kid who wasn't making it in Chicago. That was my fantasy, like Augie March. Anyway, and I did a paper. I always got interested in stuff, and so the class the next week. This is the second or third week. At the end of the class, this professor says, and Seymour Hersh and I, oh God, what did I do? And I'm in the back row, so I sneak up, and he said, I walked up in the conversation, and there's a gap that I'll tell you about in a second because I didn't remember. Anyway, he said to me, what are you doing here? And I knew what he meant. I said, well, my father just died, and I'm doing this. And he said, okay. He said, where do you live? And I told him on the south side. He said, can you meet me at the University of Chicago admissions office? And I said, yes, and I did, and I took these tests, and Chicago in those days, just the post-Hutchins days, because I read books on Chinese history, I placed out of some history courses, the English, of course, I was always a good writer, but I went to school, and I forgot about it. I went to Chicago, and I remember my first week there, I was asked whether I was a Socrates or a Platonist or a Maoist, and I thought the last one was meowist. What's a cat got to do with it? Not quite literally, but close. Anyway, so go by 25 years. 1983, I do the Kissinger book, which my wonderful editor Jim Silverman is here.
You never kept in touch with Cogan.
I blocked it.
Blocked it.
I just repressed it. I just went on. And one day, there was a lot of mail forward to me because the book was very controversial because I wasn't kind to Henry. And most of the Washington Press Corps was very kind to Henry. Anyway, and one day my wife opens the letter and she says, oh my God, you better read this. And it was from Cogan saying, I've thought about you a lot. and I really adored your book. And there were two people I intervened with. And suddenly I start crying, like I almost am now, because I remembered it. And I remembered what he said. He saved my life. So anyway, after that, I, of course, stayed in touch with him. I did some speeches. He ran the, when you, not the fight, the honors club in colleges, what the club. Yeah, I went and spoke a couple of times for him. He was then chairman of the English department at the University of Illinois AVP, or Circle. It's a very big school now, quite good school. But that's how it started. Anyway, the point is, after that, for years, anytime even some junior college teacher, high school teacher wanted me to go, I'd try and go. Because, he intervened twice with another, he told me another doctor who became a neurosurgeon, so he felt very good about me. So it was just, he died of heart failure in 2002, but I stayed in touch with him, of course. How could you not?
But he saved your life, literally.
Yeah. I mean, he saved my intellectual life anyway, I think. I don't know what I would have done. Probably been a lawyer. My God.
Well, you went to law school.
Oh, I hated law school.
And you dropped out of law school, which is
you have to understand, University of Chicago, I was a good student at Chicago, and one of my friends had left one of my friends was a wonderful guy named David Curry, and in his last year, he left in the junior year, and by the time I graduated, he was first in his class at Harvard, and his father was a law professor, and I was friendly with his father. I got out of Chicago. I graduated in '58. I didn't want to go to graduate school in English. I did English and I did history. I felt I wanted to grow up. Maybe I'll go to law school. So in late August, because I couldn't get a good job, I wanted to work. I wanted to work in companies where apparently my ilk wasn't welcome. I don't know. Anyway, I couldn't get a good job. And so at the end of summer, I went to see the professor, and I said, I think I'll go to law school. And this was about the 28th, and I was accepted 2 days later. So I had no motivation. I liked it the first quarter. And then we got into stuff that was so boring, tenant law and English Paxton law, and it was just so boring, I just stopped. I hated it. So I basically was kicked out.
And then you dropped out and went to a poker game where you lost all your money.
Well... I always lost all my money. I later ended up in the Army, and I always lost all my money. I was a terrible poker player. I had lived in various places. I stayed in Hyde Park, and I bummed around. I eventually started a newspaper there, but that's okay. But I bummed around for another year, and I moved from one, and eventually I met somebody in the bar who was working for something called City News Bureau. And there was a news agency in Chicago that had been set up in World War II. Some of you might remember Front Page. It's a classic play Ben Heck wrote that had a revival here about 5 years ago in New York. It was about a street reporter for City News. This agency started the 4 papers and the wire service. There was so much crime in Chicago in the heyday of mob days, Dillinger and all that, late 20s, early 20s. They started a news agency for people working for the 4 Chicago papers, and maybe there were more than 4 back then. There were 4 by the time I got around. The radio stations, even the wire services, everybody paid. There were about 50 of us who worked there, and we covered the police courts, police stations, the various, where the cops hang out, the stations, and we also covered courts. And so I went to work there. What happened is I didn't know what I was doing. I was selling beer in a liquor store. And just to talk about funny things, I was always a good writer, and Richard Stern, some of you don't know, he wrote Gulk, he wrote a bunch of wonderful novels. He taught English, writing, creative writing, and as a sophomore, I got into his class. I wrote an essay for him, so he always liked me. And one day I'm selling whiskey in a store in Hyde Park, and he walks in with Saul Bellow, my hero. Saul Bellow had. This is the days of the anti-hero when he used to lecture, and he was in the Committee of Social Thought, and I used to always take girls to dates to see him because he had eyes. I've met 3 people with his blue eyes. One was Paul Newman. I worked with him when I worked in politics for Gene McCarthy. One was Dan Ellsberg, who I got to know very well, who's really incredibly smart and interesting. And the other one was G. Gordon Liddy, one of the people that were involved in the Watergate break-ins. So it just shows you bright blue eyes. But here was the conversation that literally happened. I'm selling whiskey. And Bellow and Stern were sort of like, womanizers a little bit. So they were having a night chasing. It was Saturday night, and they came and they bought little bottles of scotch for me. And Stern looked at me. He hadn't taught me in 3 or 4 years, but he talked to me sometimes on campus and something in a coffee shop. And I swear to God, his line was, "What are you doing here?" So that made me think I better move on. Anyway, somebody told me about City News, and I was in an apartment where I lived. And I went down and I applied. And the thing at City News Bureau was, if you had a BA, you could be there. They had hired 2 people off the street, and the other half came from Medill School of Journalism, which was a very good graduate school of journalism at Northwestern. And when I was there, people like Mike Royko was there as a reporter. You know, it was a very hard-edged stuff. And anyway, a couple months go by, and I've moved from where I was. The only thing I did was I gave my phone number. And it was, and I went to my old apartment to play poker in what they called table stakes, where as much money as you had, you could bet. Well, I was out of it in about 2 hours. I had no money. So I slept there in my old apartment because there was a couch I liked. And in the morning, must have been a weekday. In the morning, the phone rang, and nobody was there, and I picked it up around 9 o'clock, and it was a guy named Walter Ryberg, the Day City editor. He said, "I'm looking for Hersh." "Hey, it's me." He said, "Your name's come up, ready to work?" And I didn't even know what he was talking about. City News, $35, $40 a week. And I said, yes. And I started about 5 days later, and I became a copy boy at City News. And I watched it, and it was exciting. And there was an editor there. I used to always work the night shift in the beginning, midnight to 8, and there was an editor there who was very brutal but very bright. It turns out he was a Joycean scholar, and he was always interested in me because I was reading books. And he used to just torture me. He used to say, he used to scream at me, "You're the dumbest Jew I've ever met. You can't get the coffee right or the sandwiches right." I do that. And he'd send me out at 10 below zero to cover a manhole fire, and the cops would say, the fire department would say, "What are you doing?" And I'd go back and I'd say, "There's nothing there." And he said, "Give me the name of the guy running," torture. But within 6 weeks, I was put on the street. I became a police reporter in Chicago in 1969. And let me tell you about that, 1959-60. And so you could do anything you wanted as a police reporter in Chicago as long as you didn't touch 2 things: cops stealing, cops shooting what they called niggers in the back, because I had something.
You saw that happen.
I heard about it firsthand, and I tried to report on it. I was warned not only by another cop, but by the editors of my paper, "You'd be in trouble if you report this story. I had to go in the Army anyway. So I learned about self-censorship. I didn't do it, even though I knew he had done it and I saw the police report. The other thing was, you couldn't report about the cops and the mob, Sammy Giancana. So the way it worked is, if you're working downtown and some guy is found there's a street called Rush Street where all the nightclubs were, still are, I guess, and it was the mob controlled, and we sort of knew that. If some guy was found in the street with 14 bullet holes and is reported as an automobile accident, you stayed away from that because the cops would know that you're not part of them. So I learned about tyranny really very early. I learned about tyranny. There was a tyranny. It's still going on in Chicago. You see, there was an editorial, I think, in the Times or the Washington Post the other day saying something's got to be done about the Chicago police who just shoot people on sight. It hasn't stopped. And it's amazing. I did learn about tyranny. I also learned about the limits of my profession. I also learned how much I liked it. There was something so exciting about being there. And I was verbal, and this was all verbal. You would see it, and you'd dictate to a rewrite desk. Later, when I covered the AP, I got to the AP covering the Pentagon in 65.
So you got to Washington.
Well, I covered McNamara, and what you do is there'd be a news conference, and the AP's job was, with UPI and Reuters and AFP, we'd hire somebody, only a few phones in the Pentagon. Somebody would stay in one of the phones. The phones were real then back in 65. They had phones, telephone booths. He'd hold it for me, the line open. I'd come out for the news conference, and the first thing I'd do is dictate a bulletin. He was always a bulletin about the war. And I dictate, just from notes, I dictate a bulletin and running matter, and then I dictate a first lead, 800-900 words. And then I go and write a story about what he said. And then what I did, I would stay late and then write a second day story about the lies he told. But I could do it the second day. But the first day I had to be a parrot. I had to, like we like to think Pravda is, and just parrot what they said.
So when you get to Washington and start working for the AP and reporting on McNamara.
Well, I did UPI, I did a lot of other stuff first.
But it's clear from the book, at one point you in the memoir, you begin to reveal some of your techniques for how you get your stories. And one thing that becomes very clear to me was that you learn to cultivate military officers because you realize that when you ask them a blunt question straight up, they would answer. And then you made a practice of figuring out when they retired.
4 months
because
afterward.
then they would,
4
then they
months.
would
Give
talk
them
even
4
more.
months to get bored.
And you watched the obituaries.
Oh yes. It's
So-
it's it's more complicated. I'll put it. I'll make it a little more sophisticated than that. You've got to find, and they exist. They exist in the CIA. They exist everywhere. You got to find those people. It's far fewer now, whose loyalty, when they take the oath of office in the military, it's not to the admiral. It's not to the president. It's to the Constitution. It's the same in the intelligence agencies. So you got to find those people that really believed in it. So I had got nuts about the war in '62. My initial focus on the war, I used to have to hike. It was harder to get to New York Times then than it is now in Chicago. I used to go down to one out-of-town newsstand every morning early. And if I was working the night shift, midnight to 8, even when I was a copy boy, I'd pick it up on my way down. I had to take a train to the south side where I lived. I'd pick it up in the morning. So I read the papers. I began to read some of the French stuff from Dien Bien Phu. I read that wonderful man, what's his name, who wrote all those great books on Vietnam, The American. Anyway, one thing about being 300 years old or 800 years old is you don't remember. Anyway, and so I was into the war. My initial thought was, like a lot of the reporters, that, okay, we should fight communism there, but we weren't fighting it the right way. But I began to read, then the Protestant church groups began to put out books about war crimes. And Bertrand Russell had his work, and I read the Tribunal, and there is unbelievable testimony from GIs from early '65 on. And I found one of them. He'd moved on by '66, '67. He was back in Cleveland, and I knew it was right. He would say yes. What I said. So I knew the war was a bloodbath, and so I get to the Pentagon, and my job is, I'm the AP reporter. I'm the guy that ends news conferences. I'm sort of, the AP was great to me. I was a good reporter. I was always writing good stories. I made a friend of Martin Luther King, and the night that Lyndon Johnson passed the Voting Rights Act, I looked for him and I found him. He called me back. He was in Philadelphia giving a talk or doing something, and I said, "What do you think about Johnson's?" I'm writing a desk for the next papers, 1,600 papers that night, an overnight story, and he said, "Well, let me tell you," he said, "we're going to go down, take this act, and we're going to make 900 sheriffs terrified. We're going to go and terrify every white sheriff. We're going to go and register people." And so I wrote that story for the next day, and it was just great to do it. The power you had to move it right along. He was saying, what we're going to do with this act. We're not just going to sit back and say, wonderful. We're going to put it to work. And Bayard Rustin, so I could do that. So they put me, the job open in the Pentagon. They had no idea about my politics, which I think, how could they not? I was, but I was writing about racial stuff and the inequity of the draft, but so what? And so I go there, and what you do, there's Navy Air. The way it works, if there's a horrible incident, I did a book on the shoot down of a Korean airliner in the Russians shot down a Korean airliner thinking it was an American spy plane. Complete screw up. And what I knew right away is, Air Force. I knew that if it was on the ground or in the water, the Air Force wouldn't give a damn. But if it's in the air, they're going to really look at it. And the head of Air Force Intelligence was a very competent guy. So I went after him right away. I knew he was going to be all over that. That's the way it is. So when I got to the Pentagon, besides doing the daily crap that was going on, because the press corps was horrible, it just sat around smoking pipes and taking briefings, because it was very hard to do it. You had to go work your ass off to get a story, because it wasn't easy. There was a problem with McNamara wasn't telling the truth about airplanes. We were losing more. I knew that from watching The Hill. We were losing more. And so I knew the Navy Air. So the admiral running Navy Air, 3 or 4 star admiral, I went to him and I said, "You're being taken for a ride." He said, "Don't I know it?" And I said, let me help you. He said, "Let me help you." He said, so I wrote some series for the AP about the loss rate being much greater than they're telling the truth on. Put a lot of heat on McNamara. And discovered then he was a psychotic liar right away. But that got you into a 4-star.
Right.
And that gets you into other 4 stars. So you do it that way. It's not, yes, with the intelligence people, I always watch people who retire. And I find a lot of people in obits because I got very lucky. I'd wait 6 months and call the wife up. And I'd say, I know your husband worked in...
Very devious.
No. Well, I would say who I was. I wouldn't pretend to be anyway, I would just say, I know your husband had troubles with the operations against Allende in Chile. I did know that much. And I heard that. And I said, I just wondered. She said, well, he was very upset about it. She said, well, hold on, let me look. I think there's a couple boxes he told me never to go into. And that's the kind of stuff you would get by doing it.
So around this time, you also, when you were working at AP covering the Pentagon, you became friends with Izzy Stone.
Izzy Stone became friends with me. He found me. I mean, I'm serious.
Right.
Izzy Stone.
And you take these long walks.
But
with
Izzy Stone was, he didn't know me from Adam. He just saw my AP stories about the war, and he figured out where I was. But here's what he does. I'm married about 2 years. I'm in Washington. It's a Saturday night. We get to bed at 1 or 2 o'clock. And it's 6:30 in the morning. It's the first conversation. Every time I call, I'm in the phone book. He said, are you Seymour Hersh? He said, yes, this is I.F. Stone. He said, have you seen page 19 of the Philadelphia Bulletin today? He would go at 6 o'clock and get the out-of-town papers and start reading them. Izzy Stone was, and you know, the people that wrote him off as some sort of, are you kidding? He was just a fanatic truth teller. And brilliant.
At one point, you tell the story of how you let Izzy get into the AP offices.
But Izzy Stone was a marked man because he was writing all these stories that were embarrassing the government. And the AP was so basically terrified of embarrassing the government, which is why I eventually was driven out of the AP. They began to scream at me about my Vietnam reporting. So they transferred me to Health and Human Services from the Pentagon. So I knew how to leave. That's the way they do it. They didn't fire me. But anyway, so Izzy Stone... I wanted to, there was something that every day there was a briefing in the Pentagon called the 5 o'clock Follies, and the AP would get a copy. And these are dynamite because they were straighter there than they were in Washington. And these are much more honored. The guys they're giving, well, we had these losses yesterday and that. And Washington would always lie about everything or put a patina on it. And so I wanted to get him, I wondered if I could share him with outsiders. Absolutely, it was a no-no. And so there was one weekend, I used to do... because I was Jewish, I do Christmas tricks. And I will tell you this story. The first one I did a double trick for the New York Times. The first year I was there, and that meant I went early in the morning. I was the only editor there. I write a weather story. If there was a crisis, I'd call a reporter. But I was the editor all day, and it was Christmas Eve, and about 10 o'clock at night, Scotty Reston, who didn't like my reporting very much, although he didn't mind me necessarily, but didn't like reporting, came up in black tie with Paul Nitze, a very big diplomat then. This was 72, 73, the first winter I was there at the Times. And he came in around 10 o'clock, a little bit to the wind, and the liquor stores are closed. I was sure he had an office in the back. I was sure he was going to get another bottle. And he looked at me for a long second, and he said, Hersh, aren't you going to get that exclusive for Jesus for the second edition? And I was, needless to say, very ambivalent about that comment. It was his way of saying, we don't like reporting about grand juries and Watergate and stuff like that and presidents. They didn't like doing presidents. But anyway, whatever your question was, I probably didn't answer it. Oh, so Izzy. So Izzy's, I'm working a trouble trick, and I say to Izzy, come in. So I get there at 8 o'clock in the morning. There's an overnight guy. At 8:03, Izzy walks in. And there's only me and a typewriter guy all day. It's Christmas Day, and I'm working Christmas Day. My wife wasn't happy about it. That's the way it goes. She came down and had lunch with me. But anyway, Izzy comes in, and I walk him to the library where all the daily things, the daily briefings are this big because they were 30 pages each. And so I just leave him there. As I said in the memoir, I said, every once in a while, I'd hear a little yelp of joy. And I'd go back and ask if he wanted a sandwich. No, I'm happy. And he stayed about 8 o'clock at night and then left. And then he wrote...
12 hours.
Oh, yeah. I mean, but then he wrote on this I.F. Stone Weekly the next week, a devastating story because over the holiday we had declared a truce and we accused the other side of violating it. He showed in the daily reporting how we sent something like 600 more airplanes in to land with guns and weapons because the other side couldn't shoot at the airport. During the airport was always a target of missiles, but they had stopped in the ceasefire, so we just loaded up. We had hundreds more planes come in over 4 days, over whatever the truce was. And so he just showed it. He just showed how we lied with facts and figures from the briefings.
So this sort of illustrates something that I've always assumed about Izzy, is that he wrote from documents.
Oh my God.
He just loved the documents. And of course you love documents too, but you also did interviews. Which are more important? Or
well,
one leads to the other?
There's a certain point in the 70s when they got smart about freedom of information, and they began to lie in the documents. And I learned that from somebody, one of Henry Kissinger's guys, and he's dead now, Larry Eagleburger, who was cynical, but cynical enough to say to me, don't worry about what's going into the most top secret files you guys are always sniffing about. Henry makes sure there's nothing in there that's going to burn us. So the internal reporting I knew had gone south. They learned how to deal with freedom of information and not give away anything. And so I didn't, documents are nice. I always like documents. I'm parking my thing here because I have some, I'll just tell you what I just,
keeping my eye on
I'll
it.
just tell you what I did. There was a Democrat that was a very high-end public servant, Yale, Harvard Law School, very wealthy family, a long tradition of public service. He joined the Democrats, and when Nixon won, he stayed on, amazingly, in a very important job at the Pentagon, even though he was a nominal. He was. I don't think he was necessarily a Democrat. I think he was just a public servant, a very wealthy family. And in 72, late 71, he leaves. Obviously, he couldn't take it. And he ended up being an ambassador, and a very important ambassador in the Carter administration. And so I'm doing something that has to do with that history. And so this is something I just did in the last 2 weeks. I went looking for his papers. And they weren't at Yale, they weren't at Harvard, they weren't at his fancy prep school. They weren't at his father's and his grandfather's alma mater, which was different. And he had children. So I called up the son with his name, and I had trouble reaching him. They're a family, wealthy families are hard to reach by just calling. They only, like that wonderful line that about Ted Williams, he only answers to God's. Anyway, they only answer to God. So, but I found one was a doctor, and I got his email, and I wrote, and he called me back. I said, he said, yeah, I know who you are. I said, there was something I was asking, some historical thing that happened back in those years. And I said, do you know why there's no papers anywhere? And he said, no. He said, I didn't know that. He said, Dad was very discreet. He died about 10 years earlier. He said, Dad was discreet. And he said, I'll ask the rest of my family. And he called me back a couple of days later. He said, none of us know. We don't know where his papers are. I said, well, why don't you call your lawyers? And, everybody has. So he called me back a week later, and he said, this is really amazing. It turned out about 10 years after he left the government, and we learned this from one of the lawyers, there's a major town in Connecticut, not so major, just a town, rather. They lived in one of those fancy suburbs, not Greenwich, Darien, something like that. He went to Stamford, and he rented forever in one of those facilities that have rental storage places. He rented a storage place, and that's where he put his papers. So I didn't have to ask him. He said, don't worry, we're going to go in, and I said, I'm not getting near that. Just do that all by yourself. I of course, will volunteer anytime you want, but I better not. He said, I got it. And he called me back, and just yesterday, that's what I have here, he said, I found what you're looking for. It was a series of handwritten notes in a file. He said, I know what you were looking for. And he said, and then he reproduced them and sent them to me.
This is the next big scoop.
It's something empirical is something that isn't empirical. It's something empirical, and he says, use anything you want, but I'll type out he's a lefty, very hard to read handwriting, but he wrote note after note to himself of something that was going on that was being covered up that was causing him enormous dismay. And that's one reason he left the government. And it turned out, the clue was that the tapes didn't start, Nixon tapes didn't start to 71, and there's a tape where Nixon and Kissinger talk about him. That son of a bitch, we never could trust him. So I knew there was something there. I read that tape earlier. That's one of the things you do. You read things like that, and you make note of who they're complaining about because there's some reason. So I do that too. Reading is, you know what it's all about? I speak at journalism schools. They say, what's the trick? I said, the trick is read before you write. It's not much of a trick. If you really want to get deep, the other deep thought is get the hell out of the way of a story. There's no such thing as a fantastic story. There's a story in the telling that is fantastic. And that just means you have to work harder.
So that brings us to Henry Kissinger.
Oh,
again,
sure.
whom you say that the man lied the way most people breathed. But at one point in the book, this is lovely, you know, Henry was recording all his phone conversations. Yes. So lots of great documents there again. And these telephone transcripts become a source for your memoir. So at one point, there's a transcript of you calling up Henry.
Right.
Hi, Dr. Kissinger. I know we're driving you half crazy. Then you begin to interview him about something. So there must have been lots of other material that didn't make it into the book.
So what happens with Kissinger is I had gone to Vietnam early in the war. The first reporter there since Harrison Salisbury in 72. I was in Hanoi and places like that. And when I was going to go, I was at the New Yorker then, for working for wonderful William Shawn, and who once said to me, just to talk about journalism, the first thing I ever did for Shawn was some long article about some horrible stuff. And Shawn hired me I walked in, it's an amazing story. I just walked in, everybody said he'll never hire you. I said, the Times and Post wouldn't hire me because I worked in politics for Eugene McCarthy. I couldn't stop the war with my wonderful journalism. I thought maybe McCarthy, who wanted to run, that would be the right thing to do. It wasn't, it didn't work, but it was fun to do it anyway. And so I do this story for him, and I have a great editor there. And this is in the days where, in the New Yorker, it was a writer's magazine. If there was a problem with something, they would call you and discuss it. No significant change was made. And I worked with an editor named Pat Pro. It was a long story. And I had two things happen. My first real encounter with him. I just walked in to see him, and after 10 minutes of going, blah, 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 he said, fine, Mr. Hersh, okay, go work. Anyway, some story I had. I wasn't even articulate. I remember he said 500, okay. And I said, 500 what? He said 500 a week draw in 72, 19. My last job at the AP was for $150 a week. What is he talking about? I said, are you kidding? Anyway, the bottom line is, so I call on, the first thing I say to him, the story he said I should do. I was doing a project and I ran into something in South Dakota. And I said, I'm sorry it's so long. And he said, oh, Mr. Hersh, he said, stories are never too long or too short. They're too boring or too interesting. And so I do a story, and I'm waiting. These are the days of mail, and I get a proof. And my editor said, Shawn likes to read the proof of very closely the proof of the first, of New Hire, the first story. And it ran about 40 galleys, each of about 400 words, not that long. And I look at it, and first galley's fine, the lead and the beginning. And the third page, his first comment, he circles a cliche. It's just a figure of speech, not a violent one, a cliche. And he had a little small handwriting. On the margin, he wrote, Mr. No dot, Hersh, H-E-R-S-H dash, please, P-L-S, use words. Wow, a master's degree in Columbia right there, right there. So it was just, but anyway, I don't know what I was talking about. Old people have the right to forget.
We're running out of time.
Oh my God, we've asked a lot of questions from the audience.
Yes.
But you haven't heard anything, so it doesn't matter.
So, speaking of the New Yorker, you've had several iterations at the New Yorker. And you've worked with David Remnick, who decided not to take your story about the killing of Osama bin Laden. Now, I've read that story, and maybe I'm in a minority, but I think it's credible. You know, it makes no sense to me that the Pakistani intelligence people would not know about Osama living down the street.
40 kilometers away in a resort.
So Remnick apparently was worried
Oh,
about your reliance on one same old tired source.
Why are you going
And you
there?
point out to him that it's the same source that you were using for all these other fabulous stories.
Let me stop and tell you something. Let's leave it at that. Just so you know, 2 years earlier, I'd spent a great deal of time in Pakistan because I will tell you the most pressing problem today we have is the Pakistani nuclear arsenal, which is quite intense and quite sophisticated. And the guys running it are very irrational, I think, by our standards anyway. The leadership is okay, but it's a country with tremendous divisions in it and a lot of dislike of Americans. We've made it that way because we've cheated on most of the agreements we've had. And I went in, and the thing is, we have a secret team that will work with the Indians and the Israelis in case we see them arming a nuclear weapon. And the main goal of the American intelligence community is to know where their bombs are and take them out before they can arm them. This is a big, huge deal. And the panic in the community is, of course, the word of art in the community is we're worried about a few of the missiles that have been lost in the tall grass in the runway. In other words, there's some that may be out of the count that the Pakistani intelligence service is just saving in case. Obviously, they know what we want to do. It's a game. And so I go there in '69, and I spend 2 or 3 weeks there. And I come back and I write a story about, and I knew a lot about
69?
79, 89, 2009. Yeah, I get confused. Anyway, I was there in 2009. This is for David, who I do like. I mean, we have obviously differences, but I do like him, and he's a jolly fellow and very smart and a good writer. And so what happened is, in this story, I knew something from the American community, I knew something from the Indian community, I knew something from the Israeli community. The Israelis are very complicated because if you just look at Bibi, there's a whole level of military guys that don't want to go to war with Iran and want to see a stable Syria. The alternative to Bashar Assad is ISIS or al-Nusra or Sham al-Sham. All these, that's no alternative. And they always were able to deal, particularly with his father and with him. And so they know that. So I'm not sanguine about anything. Anything can blow up, but anyway. And so I write a story for David that the Pentagon denies, the usual stuff. And it's a big, long story, and the magazine closes on Friday, and we're closing on Thursday. And we give it on Wednesday, the checkers bring a list of questions. And the Pentagon sends snotty, nasty, no lie, this is all bad. And I get a call from him Friday after the piece is closed. And he says, we got a problem. And I said, what is it? And he said, somebody very important said to me, if we run the story the way we're running it, they will have to send all, and it's going to be published Monday, they're going to have to immediately send all family members home from the embassy and the consulate. We're going to expect riots.
In Pakistan.
Because I was describing how we're going to stick it to the Pacs if they ever do it. And so we changed the story enormously. We muted it, and we had to. I mean, I don't want to be responsible for American embassies being overrun and blown up, even though it pained me to do so because it was important to do it. There was enough in it, but we changed it a lot. So this history you have to know. Clearly, I was able to get information in Pakistan. And the truth is, I learned most of what I learned in Pakistan about bin Laden. And so when you're talking about one old tired source, that wasn't the real source. There was other people. There was a source so that was just it. That's just the way it goes. I can't guess about motives. He just didn't want to do the story. He didn't like it, so he said, by the way, it's not, I figured out at some point when I was going hot at the New Yorker that it was not the Seymour Hersh Weekly. It was the New Yorker. And so he has a right to say, I'm not publishing this, period. And I respect that in an editor.
Well, it was a controversial story. He was going up against...
He'd done Abu Ghraib. That wasn't a story that made a lot of friends for the magazine.
By happenstance...
Let's do questions, no more of this.
Let's go to questions?
Let's go, well, talking about... My job, as I figured out, once I figured out my point of view, which was to know different things that the government wanted, the way I look at it, at the AP I was driven out, At the New York Times, they couldn't wait to get rid of me. As soon as I started bitching about the way they covered, I was fine during the war, but when I started covering businesses and corporations and getting all sorts of trouble, they were happy to let me go. I mean, I quit, but they were happy. And the same at the New Yorker. And here's what it is. I view myself as somebody that walks into a nice editor's desk in his nice office and drop a dead rat full of lice. And I say, here's what I want to do next. It's gonna cost you a lot of money because I'm gonna hit the road. It may not work because 40% of the stuff I did at the New Yorker didn't work, and they ate it. I was just flying around, and business class was the least of it. Nothing less than that. Anyway, and good hotels, the Creon. Anyway, the good hotel. Anyway,
those were the days.
Those were the days. It was before 2008 when things collapsed. Anyway, and so I go and I drop this on their desk, and I say, if I do get it, the lawyers are going to give you hell. We're going to have all sorts of trouble with lawyers. You're going to be bothered to death by 5 or 6 of the big Wall Street companies, and you're going to get a lot of people quitting, and it's going to, they're going to get letters subscribing, and this is what I'm offering you. So I understand that. At a certain point, people get tired of that. They do.
Get tired of Cy Hersh?
Yeah, I get tired of Cy Hersh.
All right. On that note, we will end our
is it?
little conversation and open it up to
we'll run over. Is that,
please, questions from the audience now.
Still time to get to the club, guys, if you want. But I don't care. Go ahead. We'll go over. We'll run late. I'm
Microphones
sorry.
here.
Okay. I'm Lucy Komisar. I'm an investigative.
I know who you are, Lucy Komisar, but not on site.
I'm an investigative journalist. You were the moderator at the June 2016 Washington showing of the Magnitsky Act behind the scenes, the expose of the fraudster William Browder, who's invented murder of his accountant, has roiled
But you got to get to a question, Lucy.
Between the U.S. and
Lucy,
Russia.
get to a question.
The question is, people do not know that a month before that, NBC killed a major story by its reporter, which would have exposed Browder as a fraud.
But that's not a question.
Now,
Please,
what is your,
don't do a speech, Lucy.
Know
don't do a
about
speech.
the film,
Don't do a speech,
and
please.
My question was, would you comment about the U.S. media's failure to tell the truth about Browder and his Magnitsky hoax?
I think the particular show that you have to understand that I have a family that did a Russian adoption. And one of the problems with the Magnitsky Act is Putin got very angry and cut off adoptions, and it's a 6 to 9 month process, and it was brutal for families in the middle of it. So that was part of the reason I was asked by somebody to moderate the documentary that led to the cutoff. And it was a good documentary, and I thought it should be shown, and it wasn't shown. But I can't go beyond that. I can't make you happy. I can't talk about things I didn't report firsthand. I've read your stuff, and it's very credible. It sounds great to me, but don't ask me to do it. It's just not fair. Okay? Let's go on.
But the media won't publish that.
Well, but that's a problem for you to raise with the media, but not here necessarily, Lucy. Go ahead.
Okay, so I want to start by saying that your work.
You're going to start?
I'm going to start, yeah.
What are you going to finish with?
You'll see. Well, your work on Abu Ghraib is a big part of what inspired me to become a conflict journalist, and that's led me to reporting directly from Syria.
Can you do me a favor and just slow down a second?
Sure.
I hear you, though.
Your work on Abu Ghraib was a big part of what inspired me to become a conflict journalist.
Great, good.
And as a result, I reported directly from Syria in 2012, 2013, and 2014 when I embedded with Syria's White Helmets and saw that they are indeed genuine rescue workers. And more recently, I reported in 2015 from Syria, and then this August I was also back in Syria. Following the April 2017 sarin attack in Khan Sheikhoun, you wrote an article claiming that the cataclysm which killed dozens was caused by, among other things, fertilizer and insecticide igniting
by a bomb, a Syrian
strike.
bomb that dropped and destroyed a storage bin.
Right,
Yes.
but subsequently, the OPCW, the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, conducted
Oh, you're getting into such technical stuff. Just ask your question. Go ahead.
Hang on. The OPCW collected samples which were
Does
provided-
anybody here know what the OCPW is? Organization for Prevention of
Prohibition of Chemical Weapons.
Chemical weapons. Prohibition.
The Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical
You would
Weapons
know.
conducted
I know
an
Katrina would know.
investigation using samples which were provided both from the Syrian regime and the Syrian opposition.
No,
and
it's not.
then-
They weren't provided by the Syrian regime, but that's okay.
They were. They were.
Oh, well, you can argue with me, but ask your question. So the question
will
is, why did
Google it
I believe?
afterwards.
Why did
They
I wrote
were-
what I believe?
They were provided by the Syrian regime as well.
Oh,
actually.
but ask your
And also
question.
hang on. And also, Sarin samples were also taken from blood with full chain of
Please
custody.
ask your question. We can't re-argue this. What's your question?
Now that the UN has come out definitively to say that there was a sarin attack in Khan Sheikhoun.
That's not what they did at all. I'm sorry.
Sir, I'm sorry they did.
Well, when? There was a report that said no. There was. Are you kidding? The panel that was this. The panel was that was the end of the panel. They broke it down. You remember there was.
Yeah, because the Russians vetoed it.
Oh well, of course the Russians vetoed and the Syrians vetoed it. But what's your question?
So my question is, are you sticking with the pesticide and fertilizer theory?
I'm sticking with the bomb dropped on a building that was a headquarters. That was a targeted building.
So no sarin.
Yeah.
There was no sarin.
Absolutely. There's been no investigation by the OPCW. Here's the thing that really got me about the OPCW. I understand. I know the UN groups well. I know people who worked in that group. The organization is OPCW. I know people who worked in it. I know people who left it, and they have rigorous rules because they're a UN agency for when they do technical reporting, particularly on incidents where, as you know, they've been involved in other bombings. They were involved just in the alleged chlorine gas attack in East Ghouta. Just on the OPCW is involved in that, and the guidelines are you spend at least 2-3 months before you make a judgment. The OPCW made 3 statements within 2, 4, 6 weeks. 3 statements, 2 weeks later, saying we're pretty sure it was sarin. When they hadn't been there, it was really a bad show. So I just have a different point of view. I know the people that I've talked to for many years, and I can tell you. So we disagree. That's all. I absolutely stand by it.
I have to correct you if you're not going to be honest to the audience.
There's all different truths. I'm not saying your truth isn't a truth, but let's not argue.
The Syrian government did provide a
please,
sample.
do me a favor. We can get into Syria all week.
It matters.
The Syrian government, let me say something to you. It's brutal. It was a brutal civil war. And I know
I was just there.
Let me just finish. Let me just say this, just generically. It's a horrible war on all sides. And he over-responded Bashar Assad. You can argue that all week. And it's been going on for years. It's getting over now. He's going to win the war, whether it's good or bad. But if he had lost the war, like Mussolini, he would have been hanging from a lamppost with his throat cut with his wife and 2 children next to him. And you would have had a pretty crazy group running it that was involved in Sharia law. And the moderate Muslims, who by and large, I think polls will show moderate Muslims in Syria, basically, the polls show they weren't enthusiastic about him, but certainly would give him a majority on an honest election if there ever was one. So desperate things happen. Will you let me finish? Desperate things happen. And I know a country that when it was in a war in which there was a chance they could lose, even at the end when it looked good, the chance that the America that lived today would not be, that did what? Dropped 2 nuclear bombs, firebombed Tokyo, spent a year and a half with the Brits doing day and night bombing on German cities, all of which we later learned from polls and studies, increased the morale. People do terrible things in war. So I'll just say to you that if you want to talk to me later about it, I don't think we should take everybody's time with an internecine argument. Of course I stand by my story. I've been asked that many times. So and I have a different view of the white helmets than you do, period.
But you weren't
But
there.
I just do. That doesn't mean you're wrong. I have a different view.
With them in
Why are you
Syria.
arguing with me? Let somebody else talk. We'll do 2 more questions, okay?
Sai, could you comment on the Khashoggi killing?
I like everybody else. He was wonderful. He was somebody you talked to. I'm sure what I'm going to say is just I can't if I always think about Hariri, how he ended up being kidnapped, and I can tell you, Salman is the worst. What's going on in Yemen is the worst. The American role in it is the worst. It's a story ignored. I mean, not by the press. Tell me any time cable news, has spent more than 3 minutes a year on Yemen. All these people doing. I mean, I understand it. The more they do in the Orange Man, the more ratings they get. But they don't cover the rest of the war. It's a horrible, awful, awful war. That bad things are happening. Worse right now. Worse things are happening. Anyway, this is a horrible man running a horrible country, and talk about killing. They still behead people in the eastern provinces, Shia, and they hang them upside down, let them drain the blood drain out. They still do that. They're in a very primitive country, but the other side of me says, 2 airplanes with 15 people flying in the same day. I mean, if they did do it, if they did do exactly what it's the most amateur, most incompetent effort to murder somebody I've ever seen. I just can't believe they could. It was just so stupid what they did. If they want to kill him, what a way to do it. So I don't know. I mean, and I don't, the Turks, I'll tell you what pisses me off. We do better in Turkey than people think. We do a lot better in collecting stuff. And so we know if the Turks are playing around inside embassies, we know what they're doing. I mean, I can't, it's NSA stuff. I don't want to get it. I know stuff that I don't like to, if it's not a story, I don't like to yap about it. So I wonder what the hell he's doing with this, because we do know more. And when the Orange Man says things like, well, if he's dead, maybe, it's like he seemed to know what the FBI were going to do about Kavanaugh very early, did he not? So it's also possible. Supreme Court justices, I don't want to break your heart, but if they're picked by a Republican in the Nixon days, and certainly in the with Lyndon Johnson with his pet that he wanted, they always tell the president the night before what's going on, what they're going to do, what the vote's going to be. They always do that. There's always a back channel. I mean, it's just horrible but true. So it's a political operation anyway. We're doomed in a way, I think, but it doesn't matter because the market's doing well until the other day.
So,
Let's
are
go
you
on.
suggesting that
I'm
the
sorry
United
to be
States-
rude to the guy, but
You
we could
are-
argue about. I always run into Syrian arguments, and we all write bad stories, but that wasn't one. He's not telling you part of it. There was something else going on. That reason we dropped the bomb there. Yes, ma'am. Two more.
You said this evening that Stern and Saul Bellow engaged in, quote, womanizing.
No, they were just
unquote.
flirts, big flirts.
So my question is,
Flirts. They were flirts. That's all I
my
meant.
question is, can you expand upon that?
No.
And what and what exactly did they do when they womanized?
No. All I talked about is they were very flirty. That's all. They were flirty. They were flirty. And in Stern's case, the way it showed up, so far from what you think, it was a writing seminar that I got into, and I was, 18, 19, and I just basically still working in my father's store. I mean, I was, what did I know? And he asked everybody to write their life story. And what he did is he then he then mimeographed it and passed it out to everybody in the class. And some of the older women had impossible, stories that I couldn't believe. You know what I'm talking? That's all I'm talking about. That's all I'm talking about. I'm talking about, that's...
So, Cy, here's a follow-up story on...
Save me from these questions. Yes.
Here's
Anybody want to talk about, we could talk, nobody's even asking me about Trump. Go ahead, let's talk about something.
Yeah, I have a different question. I've been at the
go-
UN 12 years.
What?
I've been covering the UN for 12 years.
Yes, ma'am.
And there are many, many stories, many fights in terms of what's going on and what would be helpful for people to understand. What do we do to make a different media in this country so that the people can understand there's a war, a media war, that really needs to happen with regard to the UN in terms of there's the story, for example, Korea. There's a real story about things that have happened with Korea that could help.
Which Korea?
The one Korea that really that's really a Korea that there's two parts of it now that have been made there by the UN and other things. There's a real set of understandings that I've done some of the writing about, and a few other people have written, and they get booted out in general. That somehow the good stories need to get support, and it hasn't happened. And I'm wondering, do you see any way
I've
to
got
build?
the drift. I've got the drift. I don't know. I think when Haley's described as a leading shining light in the administration by the New York Times and Washington Post, and somebody who was very effective at her job, and when she gets that, I don't think I think the job of the New York Times and Washington Post reporter is to have access to the UN. So they have the lady that runs the UN, they have access to her by writing hagiography and stuff that have nothing to do with anything, really. They do notice when she attacks everything and does what she does. But if you read the stories just when she leaves, she was the most very effective and stuff like that. It's all high camp stuff. I don't know what to tell you, but I can't think of a worse place to be a reporter but at the UN, though, because the stories about the people that matter, nobody's going to care about. There's a whole world there that nobody cares about in the American media. You know that. We all know that. I think I'm getting a clue. This therapy session is almost over. I'm going to say goodbye, and we'll leave you. Goodbye.
Thank you.